Ah! Son, come closer, sit by me. On this cold winter night, with the crackling fire beside us, let me tell you a story that's been passed down through the centuries. A story that shook kingdoms, changed the fate of empires, and left an echo that reached across ages. Imagine a voice coming out from the mists of time, a call carried on desert winds. That call quickly filled palaces, marketplaces, even the battlefields. A belief born in the desert turned into a civilization that spanned continents. Today I'll tell you about the rise of Islam and the profound impact it had on Europe. This story isn't just about a conquest. It's an epic where cultures collide and where knowledge and warfare intertwine. Sometimes it's hidden in the clashing sounds of swords on the battlefield, other times in the hushed debates of scholars in their study halls, or in the tales told by traders traveling to distant lands. So, close your eyes and imagine we're heading to 7th century Arabia. We're about to witness how a new power, rising from the desert, carved its place on the world stage. Are you ready? Then, let's rewind time and begin our journey. Ah, son, history's greatest transformations often begin unnoticed. On a quiet desert night beneath the stars, an idea is born, a call echoes. At first it whispers to just a few ears, but over time it spreads like a wave, changing societies, empires, and even the course of entire eras. Today I'm going to take you to the heart of such a beginning. It's the year 610. In the vast deserts of Arabia, hidden between rocky mountains, there was a sacred city, Mecca. This was a trade hub where merchants stopped and idol-worshipping Arab tribes had their temples. But within the bustling crowds of this city, there was a quiet man, thoughtful, introverted, but carrying great unrest in his heart. His name was Muhammad bin Abdullah. Muhammad was a merchant known for his honesty. But throughout his life, he was troubled by the corrupt state of his society. He lived in an era where the rich oppressed the poor, tribal wars spilled blood, and he felt his people had lost their way, worshipping idols. So he often retreated to the cave of Hira, outside Mecca, quietly reflecting, seeking answers to the unrest in his heart. And then, that night, that fateful night, in the darkness of the cave of Hira, he suddenly heard a voice commanding, "Read." It was none other than the angel Gabriel. Muhammad was filled with fear, but in that moment his mission became clear. He was now a prophet. He was to bring a new call, a new faith to the people. At first, only his wife Khadija, his close friend Abu Bakr, and a few loyal followers accepted this call. But over time, his message began to echo through the narrow streets of Mecca. There is no God but Allah. These words, shaking the very foundations of the polytheistic order, enraged the powerful families of Mecca. Muhammad and his followers were mocked, ostracized, and tortured. But they didn't stop. Their faith only grew stronger under pressure, and their message reached more and more people. Mecca had become unlivable for them. So, in 622, the time came for a new beginning. Muhammad and his followers migrated to Medina. This migration, the Hijrah, would become one of the turning points in Islamic history. In Medina, Muhammad was not just received as a prophet, but also as a state builder. There, he ended the feuds between tribes and laid the foundations for the Islamic community. The years in Medina witnessed great transformations, both in terms of faith and politics. Islam became not just a belief, but a system, a justice framework. As the Muslims grew stronger, their conflicts with Mecca became inevitable. After years of struggle in 630, Muhammad and his followers returned to Mecca, almost without bloodshed. On that day, the idols in the Kaaba were toppled one by one, and Islam took root in the heart of Arabia. But my child, Like all great leaders, Muhammad's time in this world was limited. In 632, he fell ill, and as he breathed his last, he left this message to those around him. I am only Allah's messenger. After me, hold on to the Quran and my traditions. Muhammad's death did not mark the end of Islam. On the contrary, this new faith would continue to spread rapidly. Now, it wasn't just one tribe, one city in Arabia, but an entire region united under the banner of Islam. And this unity would soon extend far beyond the Arabian deserts, transforming into an empire that would reach the gates of Europe. But, my child, this is the beginning of another story. Now let's look at what happened next in the rise of Islam. My child. Now, I'm going to take you to a time of great changes and conquests. The foundations of Islam had been laid, but a long road still stretched ahead. This road wasn't just paved with faith. It was forged with the sword, strategy, loyalty, and sometimes great trials. After the death of Muhammad, how would the Muslim community carry on his legacy? The answer to this question would define the fate of the era of the four rightly guided caliphs. After Muhammad's death, there was a brief period of uncertainty among the Muslims. Who would be the leader? Who would guide the Islamic community? That day, the Muslims gathered in Medina and declared Abu Bakr, one of the Prophet's closest companions, as the caliph. He was known for his courage, wisdom, and loyalty. However, his caliphate didn't begin in peace. When news of Muhammad's death spread, some Arab tribes declared they no longer wished to remain loyal to Medina. They refused to pay zakat and even tried to break away from Islam. This sparked the Ridda Wars, or apostasy wars. Abu Bakr gathered an army and systematically defeated the rebellious tribes. In a short time, Arabia was once again united under a single banner. But Abu Bakr didn't stop there. He turned his gaze beyond Arabia. During his reign, the Islamic armies faced two mighty empires for the first time, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. Battles began in Syria against the Byzantines, while in the east, the first raids were launched against Sasanian territory. However, Abu Bakr couldn't lead these campaigns for long. In 634, he fell ill and, with his final words, passed the caliphate to Umar ibn al-Khattab. My child, listen closely to what I'm about to tell you. For Umar's reign marks the time when Islam rose, not just as a religion, but as a world power. Under his leadership, the Muslims achieved some of the greatest conquests in their history. The first target was the Byzantine Empire. In 636, the Muslim armies defeated the Byzantine forces in the Battle of Yarmouk. With this victory, the cities of Damascus, Jerusalem, and Palestine fell into Muslim hands. Umar himself went to Jerusalem and ensured the city was peacefully handed over. History never forgot his humility. He entered the city not like a ruler, but as a simple traveler. But the conquest didn't end there. The Muslim armies turned eastward, delivering blow after blow to the Sasanian Empire. In 637, the Battle of Qadisiyah, followed by the Battle of Nehavend in 642, crushed the Persians. These victories marked the end of the Sasanian Empire and brought Persian lands under Muslim control. Umar ruled the conquered lands with justice. For the first time, a structured government was formed. Governors, judges, and a financial system were established. But alas, the lives of great leaders are often short-lived. In 644, he was assassinated. The Muslims had lost a great leader, but the Islamic State was stronger than ever. After Umar's death, Uthman ibn Affan, one of the early companions of the Prophet, became caliph. During his reign, the Islamic State expanded even further. North Africa, Eastern Anatolia, and Central Asia were conquered. But what made his reign particularly significant was the compilation of the Quran into a single book. Uthman ordered the Quran to be standardized in one version to prevent disputes arising from different dialects. However, his caliphate is remembered more for internal conflicts than for conquests. Under Uthman's rule, some governors grew too powerful and discontent began to spread among the people. Especially officials close to the Umayyad family were accused of injustice. Over time, this discontent turned into rebellion. In 656, a group of rebels besieged Uthman's house and killed him. This event triggered the first major division in Islamic history. Uthman's death plunged the Islamic world into a great crisis. The caliphate was divided among the Muslims. In the end, Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's son-in-law and cousin, was chosen as the new caliph. But his reign was not defined by conquests. Instead, it was marked by civil wars among the Muslims. First, some of the Prophet's companions, including Aisha, Talha, and Zubair, opposed Ali in response to Uthman's death. This dispute turned into the Battle of the Camel. Ali emerged victorious, but the unity of the Islamic world was shaken. Later, he faced his greatest rival, Muawiyah. Muawiyah was Uthman's relative and demanded punishment for Uthman's killers. The two sides clashed in the Battle of Siffin. After the battle, an arbitration committee was formed, but this event only deepened the rift among the Muslims. Eventually, some of Ali's supporters broke away from him, forming a group known as the Khawarij. And then, in 661, a Khawari assassin's sword struck Ali. His death marked the end of the era of the four rightly guided caliphs and opened the door for the rise of the Umayyad dynasty. Ah, my child, thus the early years of Islam came to an end, filled with conquests, struggles, and divisions. But this was not the end of history. Now the Umayyads would rise to the stage and carry Islam to entirely new lands. Ah, my child, listen now. With the end of the era of the four rightly guided caliphs, a new age began in the Islamic world. This was an age born under the shadows of swords, growing through dynastic struggles, and expanding its borders. The Umayyads. They were the dynasty that transformed Islam into an Arab empire, sent armies to distant lands, and left behind not only great victories but also deep scars. But first, let me tell you how this dynasty came into being. The assassination of Ali brought the Islamic world to a crossroads. In Medina and Kufa, many Muslims wished to see Ali's son, Hassan, as caliph. However, in the east, there was another power, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Muawiyah, a relative of Uthman and the governor of Syria, had a large army at his command and controlled the richest lands in the Arab world. He had survived the war against Ali but had waited for his moment to claim the throne. Now it was time for him to establish his own rule. A struggle began between Hassan and Muawiyah. However, Hassan, not wishing to meet the same fate as his father, relinquished the caliphate to Muawiyah in 661. With this act, a new era began in Islamic history, the Umayyad Caliphate. Muawiyah did something unprecedented in Islamic history. He transformed the caliphate into a hereditary monarchy where leadership passed from father to son. This symbolized the rise of the Arab aristocracy. Some Muslims in Medina and Kufa opposed this, but Muawiyah's iron fist crushed their resistance. The center of the caliphate was now in Damascus, and the Umayyads had become leaders not only of a religion, but of an empire. But Muawiyah didn't stop at consolidating power internally. His gaze turned outward. My child, know that a ruler's power lies not only in his palace, but in the shadows of his armies. The Umayyads thought the same and embarked on great conquests. Their greatest dream was to raise the banner of Islam, both east and west. The Umayyads' greatest enemy was the Byzantine Empire. Muawiyah prepared a large army and navy to conquer Constantinople. Between 674 and 678, for the first time, the Arab armies reached the gates of Istanbul. However, the Byzantine Greek fire destroyed the Umayyad navy. But this defeat did not stop them. In 717-718, under the command of Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, Constantinople was besieged again. The city resisted, and this time, the harsh winter conditions and attacks from the Bulgars caused significant losses to the Umayyad forces. Constantinople could not be conquered, but the Umayyads advanced deep into Anatolia. My child, listen. Once, the Visigoths ruled Spain, unaware that its fate was about to change. In 711, Muslim forces under the command of Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. With his famous words, "Burn the ships, victory or death," he urged his troops forward. And victory came. In the Battle of Guadalete, King Roderick of the Visigoths was killed. The Muslim forces advanced rapidly, and much of Spain was conquered. Thus, the Umayyad Emirate of Andalusia was born in the heart of Europe. Having won in the west, the Umayyads also turned their gaze to the east. The conquest of Iran had been completed, but they had their eyes set on more distant lands, Central Asia, the Turks, and India. In 705, famous Umayyad commander Qutayba ibn Muslim entered Transoxiana. Key cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Tashkent were captured. However, fierce battles were fought with the Turkish tribes in these lands. The Umayyads were successful in some areas, but could not establish full control. My child, every rise has its fall. The Umayyads won great conquests, but over time their rule weakened. Why? First, it was their treatment of non-Arab Muslims as second-class citizens. Iranians, Turks, and Berbers had embraced Islam, but the Arabs still looked down on them. This caused great unrest. Second, there were struggles within the dynasty itself. As the Caliphate passed from father to son, brothers and cousins began to fight each other for power. Third, the rise of the Abbasids. Descendants of Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, led a major rebellion against the Umayyads. In 750, the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads and took control of the Caliphate. The Umayyads did not vanish from history, but they lost their power. Some of them fled to Spain, where they established the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba. However, the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus came to an end. Ah, my child. Thus, the first Islamic empire, the Umayyads, conquered vast lands from the borders of China in the east to Spain in the west. But no dynasty, unable to deliver justice and unite its people, can last forever. After them, a new power, a new dynasty, would rise, the Abbasid Caliphate. But that is a story for another time. Now, in the silence of the night, reflect on this history. Great empires, great wars, great leaders, all have disappeared into the deep waters of time. But we will continue to tell their stories. Ah, my child, now I will take you to one of the most striking moments in history. A new world beyond the sea, the lands conquered by Muslim armies, Arab and Berber cavalry, the power of swords and faith, the story of the great campaign that opened the gates of Andalusia. It was the year 711. At that time, the Visigoths ruled the Iberian Peninsula. But there was chaos within, succession struggles, revolts, and a weakening government. It was in such a time that the Muslims saw an opportunity. The Muslim governor of North Africa, Musa ibn Nusayr, appointed a commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad. He was to be sent across the sea into Christian lands. Tariq set off with an army of about 7,000 men, made up of Berber and Arab soldiers, a small but brave force. He crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and set foot on Iberian soil. From that moment on, this place would bear his name, Jabal Tariq, Tariq's mountain. When the Visigoth king Roderick heard that the Muslims had entered his lands, he gathered his entire army. With a large force of 2,500 men, he marched towards Tariq. But Tariq was not a man to be afraid. On that day he gathered his troops and uttered the words that would be etched in history. Behind us is the sea, before us the enemy. We have no place to retreat, either victory or death." And he ordered the ships to be burned. There was no turning back. These lands would either be taken or the people would die here. A great battle began on the plains of Guadalete. The Visigoth army was numerically superior but undisciplined. Tariq's army was small, but they were fast and agile. After 3 days of fighting, Roderick was killed, and the Visigoth army was scattered. The gates of Andalusia were now open. After the battle, Tariq ibn Ziyad and his army quickly advanced. Toledo, Seville, Malaga, Granada, one by one, these cities fell into Muslim hands. But my child, remember, conquering a land is easy, but the real challenge is to govern it. Tariq treated the local population well to maintain control of the land. He granted the Christian and Jewish communities religious freedoms they hadn't had before under Muslim rule. For this reason, many cities surrendered without resistance. However, Tariq ibn Ziyad's victory stirred jealousy in his commander Musa ibn Nusayr. He too crossed into Spain with his own army and completed the conquest. But soon after, both Tariq and Musa were called to Damascus by the Umayyad Caliph and were dismissed from their posts. Thus, the conquest of Spain was complete, but a new era was beginning, the Umayyad Emirate of Andalusia. The Umayyad Emirate of Andalusia, the lasting presence of Islam in Europe, 7561031. Ah, my child, some states are built by war, but they rise through art and knowledge, and Andalusia was just such a state. By 750, the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus was overthrown by the Abbasids. Most of the Umayyad family was killed, but one person managed to escape. Abd al-Rahman ibn Uwayya. Abd al-Rahman hid in the desert, lost his friends, and saw his family slaughtered, but he never gave up. After years of fleeing, he reached Andalusia. There, supporters of the Umayyads still existed, and they rallied behind him. In 756, he entered Cordoba and established the independent Umayyad Emirate of Andalusia. Now, Andalusia stood as the fortress of Islam in Europe. But what truly made it great was not its wars, but its science, art, and culture. My child, much of Europe was living through the Dark Ages at the time. But Andalusia was different. By the 10th century, Cordoba had become one of the largest cities in the world. 100,000 population and hundreds of mosques, palaces, and libraries. A cultural center where Islam, Christianity, and Judaism coexisted. Europe's first illuminated streets, paved roads, large baths, and hospitals. And most importantly, it was a center for science and philosophy. In Cordoba, fields like medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy flourished. Great scholars like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, Al-Zarqali, and Abbas ibn Firnas lived here. The knowledge that would later fuel Europe's Renaissance sprouted here. But my child, do you remember what I told you? Every rise has its fall. By the 11th century, the Umayyads of Andalusia were torn apart by civil wars. In 1031, the Caliphate was completely destroyed, and Andalusia was divided into small kingdoms. This division allowed the Christian kingdoms to grow stronger. Over the following centuries, the Reconquista movement began, and Muslims were slowly pushed out of these lands. But the legacy of Andalusia was not erased. Europe took the science, art, and culture it had learned there and moved forward. Andalusia was remembered not just as a Muslim state, but as one of history's greatest cultural bridges. Ah, my child, the ships that Tariq ibn Ziyad burned were not just the beginning of a war, but the dawn of an era. The conquest of Andalusia was the gateway for Islam into Europe. But remember, a civilization grows not only with the sword, but also with the pen. That is why Andalusia is still remembered today. Now think on this story, and in the darkness of the night, imagine the grand cities of Andalusia, the palaces illuminated by knowledge, for history lives as it is told. Ah, my child, some battles are not just about the clash of swords. Some battles shape eras. Some battles pull the world in two different directions. The Battle of Tours was one such turning point. The year was 732. After the Muslims had conquered Andalusia, they set their sights further north. The Visigoths had fallen. The Pyrenees were crossed. Now before them lay the lands of the Franks. If the Franks bowed down as well, the path for the Muslim armies would open all the way to Central Europe. But my child, every rise has its obstacle. Against the Muslim armies stood the iron fist of the Franks, Charles Martel. At that time, the Muslims, under the Umayyads, in Andalusia were conducting a series of campaigns against Christian kingdoms. All of Spain had been conquered, and the Pyrenees Mountains had been crossed. The Muslim commander Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi decided to march deep into France. France, with its rich lands, cities, and churches. As the Muslim army approached, the people fled in fear. Some villages didn't even dare resist. The Muslims plundered Bordeaux and continued their advance. But the Franks were determined to stand against this invasion. Leading them was Charles Martel. Some historians called him the Hammer of the Franks, because he was a master at crushing his enemies. Charles Martel quickly assembled an army with a large force of 300 soldiers, heavily armored cavalry, experienced infantry, and warriors. He prepared to stop the Muslims. And thus the Battle of Tours, which would change the course of history, began. Ah, my child, a battle is not won by soldiers alone. Strategy, patience, and intellect are required. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi planned a swift attack, using Muslim cavalry and light infantry. They were fast, agile, and deadly. They had previously defeated the Goths, who had crushed the Roman armies. But Charles Martel employed a different tactic. The Franks set up a strong defensive line. They arranged themselves in tight formations, built shield walls, and used the forested areas to slow down the Muslim cavalry. The Franks chose to wait instead of charging. This wait lasted for several days. The Muslim army did not understand why the Franks were not attacking. Meanwhile, the weather grew colder, and the Muslims had been on the march for some time, running low on supplies. Finally, the Muslims launched their attack. The light cavalry charged the Frankish lines, but the Frankish infantry held firm in tight formations. The battle raged for hours. The Muslim cavalry tried to break through the Frankish lines, but the armored Frankish warriors stood their ground. Charles Martel ordered his soldiers to remain as firm as rocks. As dusk fell, the Franks gained an advantage. At that moment, Frankish scouts attacked the Muslim camp. The Muslims' plunder was being looted, and their soldiers were thrown into panic. This panic changed the course of the battle. Many Muslim soldiers retreated to protect their camps. It was at that moment that the Franks launched a counterattack. And in the most critical moment of the battle, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi was killed. Without their leader, the Muslim army lost its organization and began to retreat. By nightfall, the Muslims were no longer on the battlefield. The Franks had won. My child, sometimes history changes with a single battle. The Battle of Tours was one such battle. The Muslim armies could not advance further into Europe. The Franks became one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. The expansion of Islam in Europe stopped, and the Muslims retreated to Andalusia. Historians still debate this battle. If the Muslims had won, perhaps Europe's destiny would have been different. Maybe in France, Germany, or England, mosques would be rising today. But history is written with realities, not possibilities. And the reality is this: the Franks won at Tours. Charles Martel became one of the greatest leaders of the Franks with this victory. His grandson Charlemagne would later establish the Holy Roman Empire, uniting Europe. Tours was a turning point in an era. And so, my child, the fate of the world changed on a battlefield. on a day when thousands of swords clashed. In the darkness of the night, think on the misty hills of Tours. It was on those hills that the course of history changed. Ah, my child, history is not written solely with battles, victories, and conquests. History is shaped by the dreams, fears, and ambitions of people. And the Crusades are the product of such ambition, such belief, and such a bloody struggle. A call rising from the heart of the West, the desire to reclaim Jerusalem, and the 100 years of blood and fire that followed. This is how the story of the Crusades begins. It all started in 1095 at the Council of Clermont. On that day, Pope Urban II addressed the crowd. His words would shake not only those in the square, but all of Europe. In that call, he urged Christians to take back Jerusalem from the Muslims. God wills it, the Pope cried out. Princes, weary from centuries of wars in Europe, now turned their gaze eastward. What they were promised was not just victory, but heaven itself. Thus the First Crusade began. Thousands of knights, monks, peasants, and adventurers embarked on a long and perilous journey. Hunger, disease, and harsh roads awaited them. But in their eyes was faith, and in their hearts, ambition. And finally, in 1099, Jerusalem fell. The Crusaders turned the city into a sea of blood. Women, children, and the elderly were slaughtered at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians were left at the mercy of these new conquerors. And sadly, mercy was rarely shown. The Crusaders had taken Jerusalem, but this was only the beginning. My child, every conquest always births resistance. When Jerusalem fell, the Muslim world was still fragmented. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad was weak. There were power struggles among the Seljuk Beys. But this situation could not last forever. And from this chaos rose a man, Imad ad-Din Zengi. He dealt the first great blow to the Crusaders. And in 1144, he conquered Edessa. This was the first major defeat for the Crusaders. With Zengi's death, his son Nur ad-Din Mahmud inherited his legacy. Nur ad-Din captured Damascus, unified the Muslim world, and began the first major moves for Jerusalem. But the real change would come through one of his commanders, Saladin. Saladin was not just a great warrior, my child. He was also a symbol of justice, patience, and mercy. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he annihilated the Crusader army and began pressing the gates of Jerusalem. And finally, Jerusalem returned to Muslim hands. But my child, the battle did not end there, for Europe would not accept the loss of Jerusalem. When Jerusalem fell, great fury erupted in Europe. 3 major kings initiated the Third Crusade. Richard the Lionheart of England, King Philip II of France, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Barbarossa died during the campaign. The French king returned halfway through the journey, but Richard was determined to face Saladin. My child, the struggle between the two is legendary. Richard was brave. He was a great warrior, but Saladin was a patient and intelligent leader. After months of struggle, Saladin and Richard reached an agreement. The treaty signed in 1192 stated, Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands. But Christian pilgrims would be able to visit the Holy Land freely. This marked the end of the battle. But the Crusades were far from over. In the following years, the Crusaders launched new campaigns, but over time, the purpose of the Crusades began to shift. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders, instead of fighting Muslims, sacked Byzantium. Yes, my child, Christian Crusaders plundered Christian Byzantium. This deep rift between East and West accelerated the collapse of Byzantium. And finally, in 1291, when the last great Crusader stronghold Acre was taken by the Mamelukes, the Crusaders' dominance in the East came to an end. My child, the Crusades were not only a battle of swords, but also a battle of ideas and cultures. During these campaigns, East and West learned much from each other. Europeans gained knowledge of Eastern medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Muslims saw Western military tactics and diplomacy methods. Trade flourished. Cities like Venice and Genoa profited greatly from Crusader commerce. But at the same time, the Crusades deepened the mistrust between East and West. Muslims began to view Christians with suspicion. In the Christian world, Turks and Arabs were seen as enemies. My child, in history, some battles are won and some are lost. But some battles continue to live on in the minds and hearts of people for a long time. The Crusades left such a legacy. And so, my child, history is not written only with the clash of swords, but with the clash of beliefs, ideas, and ambitions. Ah, my child, history is not merely the tale of great wars, bloody battles. Sometimes the fiery heat of war rises, swords are drawn, armies clash. But never forget, sometimes the greatest wars are fought with the power of pens and words. And so it was with the relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. It was a struggle that spanned centuries. Sometimes steel clashed, sometimes ink flowed. Two great civilizations fought to destroy each other, but at the same time they learned from one another and influenced each other. Now, my child, come, let me take you on a journey through the long struggle of these two mighty powers, shaken by Arab and Turkish swords, at the crossroads of East and West. Byzantium, the last great stronghold of Rome's legacy. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, stood tall. Constantinople was the heart of the Christian world. But in the early 7th century, a wave rose from the Arabian Peninsula that would shake Byzantium. With the birth of Islam, the caliphs who followed Prophet Muhammad began their campaign to expand the Islamic world. It didn't take long before Muslim armies reached Byzantine lands. In 634, the Battle of Yarmouk, the Muslims dealt a crushing blow to the Byzantine army. Syria was lost to the Byzantines. In 636, Damascus fell. In 638, Jerusalem, and in 641, Egypt. Once the brightest cities of Byzantium were now under Muslim control. My child, this was not merely a conquest. It was the first act in the centuries-long struggle between Rome and Islam. But my child, Byzantium did not fall. Muslim armies besieged Constantinople in 674 and again in 717. But the Byzantines mounted one of the greatest defenses in history. Do you know what Byzantium's greatest weapon was? It was the Greek fire, a deadly weapon that burned even on the seas. The Muslim fleet was reduced to ashes by this horrific fire. In 717, the Umayyads once again tried to take Constantinople, but the new Byzantine emperor, Leo III, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Muslim armies. Hunger, cold, and disease. The siege failed, and the Muslims withdrew. My child, sometimes an empire survives not just through the strength of its sword, but through patience and cunning. This is how Byzantium survived during those long centuries. But interestingly, my child, for every war, trade also thrives. Yes, the Arabs and Byzantines spilled blood on the battlefield, but at the same time, they traded with each other. The Byzantines received spices, silk, and precious stones from Muslim merchants. Muslim traders brought art, gold, and silver from Byzantium, and more importantly, knowledge was shared. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, architecture. Muslim scholars translated the works of ancient Greece and Rome. They took this heritage from Byzantium and made it a part of the Islamic world. During this time, these two civilizations, enemies on the battlefield, were contributing to a common future through the light of knowledge. However, my child, a new player was about to enter this centuries-old struggle. In the mid-11th century, the Seljuk Turks, who came from Central Asia, rapidly gained power in the Islamic world, and soon their eyes turned to Anatolia. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, Alp Arslan's army defeated Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, and this marked the beginning of a new era for Byzantium. The gates of Anatolia were open to the Turks, and now Byzantium was not just fighting the Arabs, but the Turks. My child, the struggle between Byzantium and the Islamic world is not merely a tale of war. It is the story of the conflict and interaction between two great civilizations. Byzantium survived for centuries against the Islamic world, but at the same time it was influenced by the Muslim world. Muslims learned from Byzantium. In art, architecture, and science, traces of Byzantium can be seen. And eventually this struggle evolved into a new phase with the Seljuks and Ottomans. Now let me share a secret with you, my child. History is not only written by the victors. Sometimes, the greatest legacy lies in the marks that the fighters leave on each other. And so the story of Byzantium and the Islamic world is filled with such marks. Ah, my child, history sometimes tells the tale of two cultures fighting to destroy each other. But at other times, it tells of how these cultures nourished and developed each other, growing together in unity. The story of the Islamic culture reaching Europe through Al-Andalus and Sicily is just such a story. Sometimes, amid centuries of warfare, there exists not just destruction brought by battle, but a cultural exchange as well. Years ago, the Islamic world began influencing Europe, not only through conquest but with a great cultural heritage. Al-Andalus was one of the first lands where Islam set foot on the Iberian Peninsula. In these lands, Arab culture merged with Christian, Jewish, and other local cultures, giving birth to a unique civilization. The capital of Al-Andalus, Cordoba, became one of the greatest scientific and cultural centers in history. My child, in the vast city of Cordoba, where once 300,000 people lived, there were not only mosques but grand libraries, schools dedicated to scientific research, and plazas where philosophers and scientists held discussions. In this city, where Islamic science reached its peak, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy flourished. But the influence of Islam in Europe was not confined to science alone. Art, architecture, literature. Muslim artists left such deep marks on Spain that Europe became fascinated with the elegant architecture, intricate patterns, carpets, and manuscripts of Al-Andalus. But the impact of Al-Andalus wasn't limited to the Iberian Peninsula. In Sicily, the Arabs left a great imprint with both trade and culture. The island became undeniably one of Europe's greatest cultural crossroads. On Sicily, a lifestyle emerged that blended Arab, Latin, and Byzantine cultures. The capital of Sicily, Palermo, transformed into a mosaic of civilizations. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together, exchanging cultural and scientific ideas. My child, this cultural exchange was a rare event, even among civilizations that were striving to conquer one another. Al-Andalus and Sicily were the first bridges in Europe where cultures, artistic heritages, and intellectual currents were shared. Now, my child, let me take you to another period. In 750, the Umayyad rule came to an end and the Abbasids took power. The Abbasids, unlike the Umayyads, established a more centralized rule in the Islamic world. This new governance embraced a system that spanned the entire Islamic world and began forming more trade and diplomatic ties with Western Europe. You see, my child, diplomacy sometimes takes place not only through the victories of soldiers, but also through the power of words. The Abbasids introduced the Islamic world to Western Europe, and in return, Europe began establishing trade and diplomatic relations with the Abbasids. For the first time, direct diplomatic connections were made with Western Europe. This opened the doors for the broader dissemination of Islamic science, philosophy, art, and culture in Europe. During the Abbasid period, Baghdad became the capital of the Islamic world. The House of Wisdom established there became one of the largest scientific research centers in the world. European merchants traveled to Baghdad, studying Islamic artworks, philosophical books, and mathematical discoveries. And this exchange of knowledge was not limited to merchants alone. Scholars from Baghdad began teaching at universities in Europe. Greek philosophy, the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and many other scholars were translated from Arabic into Latin. My child, with the Abbasid era, cultural exchanges between East and West deepened even further. But unfortunately, in 1258, the Abbasid Caliphate came to an end with the siege of Baghdad by the Mongols. Yet the cultural legacy that Islam brought to the West still lived on. Islamic sciences, mathematical discoveries, astronomy, medicine, and literature inspired a renaissance in Europe. My child, history sometimes shows the rise and fall of a civilization, but what truly matters is how lasting the marks they leave behind are. The Abbasids built the bridges that initiated the connections between the Islamic world and the West, and these bridges grew not only through trade but through cultural and scientific exchanges. These bridges are proof of how much civilizations have learned from one another throughout history. And those ancient bridges, my child, gradually became even stronger. Kid, let me take you back to the golden ages of the past, when trade routes were like delicate threads weaving the world together. The Silk Road and the Mediterranean weren't just pathways for goods, they were highways for merchants, scholars, artists, and ideas. Muslim traders didn't just bring products, they carried a rich culture, knowledge, and a deep understanding of economics. Listen carefully, because this journey is a turning point in Europe's economic transformation. Centuries ago, the Silk Road was the most important trade route stretching westward. It carried the wealth of the East from deep within its lands all the way to the heart of Europe. But kid, this wasn't just about caravans loaded with goods. The economic principles of the Islamic world also traveled this route, erasing the boundaries between East and West. Muslim traders reached countless European markets along the way. At the core of the Islamic economy was fair trade. One key principle was qarz al-hasan, interest-free loans, which ensured merchants stuck to ethical trade practices. This idea would later influence European commerce in a big way. Muslims revitalized the Silk Road with the caravanserais, marketplaces, and trade networks they established. A merchant could safely sell his goods anywhere from Al-Andalus to China, knowing the system was built to support and protect trade. Another crucial trade route? The Mediterranean. The Islamic world didn't just see it as a sea, it was a hub where trade, cultures, and ideas merged. Al-Andalus, Egypt, North Africa, and the Middle East all connected through the Mediterranean, making it one of the greatest trade networks of its time. From the eastern shores to the west, Muslim traders, including Arabs and Berbers, established commerce in Sicily, Spain, and France. They traveled by both land and sea, bringing Europe not just new goods, but also new technologies and revolutionary ideas. This wasn't just about wool, sugar, and food. This was a time when discoveries, manuscripts, and astronomical knowledge were being exchanged. Little by little, European merchants became fascinated by the Islamic way of doing business, and many of them even adopted these methods to improve their own trade. Muslim merchants were masters of organization. Long-distance trade was both safe and systematic. Caravans weren't just carrying goods, they were carrying wisdom and knowledge. Now listen even more carefully, because the economic impact of this era runs deep. Muslim traders didn't just introduce goods to Europe. They also brought economic ideas, trade practices, and financial innovations. For example, checks, promissory notes, and banking systems were first developed in the Islamic world. Muslims were the first to use financial tools that made trade more efficient and regulated. European merchants adopted these methods, making their commerce more sophisticated and structured. The Islamic economy didn't just expand European markets, it also laid the groundwork for direct trade, market management, and stronger economic ties. The commerce driven by Muslim traders played a major role in the early capital accumulation of Western Europe. Yet, every era leaves its mark on history. The impact of Islamic trade and economics didn't just last for one generation or a few decades. It shaped Europe for centuries. Muslim merchants weren't just growing economies, they were also bringing cultures closer together. Their contributions laid the foundation for many of the global trade systems we still use today. Even though the Islamic economy's influence on Europe was shaped by the scorching sun of the Mediterranean and the dusty trails of the Silk Road, every move made by those traders sparked changes that would revolutionize Europe. This transformation wasn't just about commerce. It was the beginning of a massive cultural and economic rebirth. And kid, never forget trade isn't just about moving goods. It carries some of the most valuable treasures of human history: knowledge, culture, and the ideas that shape civilizations. Just like those ancient merchants, weaving hidden pathways across the world. Kid, there are only a handful of moments in history when one era ends and another begins, completely reshaping the world. What I'm about to tell you is about one of those moments, the time when the foundations of the Renaissance were laid. But this change in the West wasn't just about new ideas emerging. It was made possible by the transfer of a much deeper scientific legacy. At a time when Europe was on the brink of revolution, the Islamic world had already unlocked the doors to ancient knowledge. And now you're about to witness how those doors open toward the West. This wasn't just the passing of knowledge. It was a meeting of civilizations, a time when ideas and discoveries intertwined. Kid, there was a time you don't know about. Back then, fields like astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and chemistry were making huge advances. And most of those breakthroughs, they were born and developed in the Islamic world. Scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn Sina, Averroes, Al-Razi, and many others laid the groundwork for Western science. In astronomy, thinkers like Ibn al-Haytham revolutionized our understanding of light refraction and observation. In medicine, Ibn Sina's canon of medicine became the go-to medical reference in Europe for centuries. Islamic scholars didn't just collect knowledge, they refined it. They relied on scientific methods, experimentation, and observation, contributing to the evolution of knowledge itself. Without this transfer of ideas from the Muslim world, the great intellectual explosion of the Renaissance might never have happened. The Islamic world became the cornerstone of Europe's scientific progress. Kid, knowledge isn't always passed through words alone. Sometimes ideas travel through books. Other times they spread through merchants and travelers. In the 11th and 12th centuries, scientific works from the Islamic world were influencing lands from China to Al-Andalus. Western scholars were rediscovering the works of ancient Greek philosophers and scientists. But many of those texts had already been preserved, studied, and expanded upon by Muslim thinkers. Many of these works were being translated from Arabic into Latin. Think about it. Aristotle's writings were so thoroughly analyzed by Ibn Rushd, Averroes, that European philosophers built their own ideas based on his interpretations. The scientific knowledge developed during the Islamic Golden Age didn't just trickle into Europe, it acted as a catalyst, accelerating the Renaissance. European scholars took this vast intellectual inheritance and used it to develop new and innovative ideas within their own societies. Al-Andalus in particular was a major hub for this transfer of knowledge to the West. And then, kid, the Renaissance exploded. Science, philosophy, art, and mathematics were reborn. But at its core, it was built upon the knowledge that had been nurtured in the Islamic world for centuries. Remember this, the Renaissance wasn't just about Western thinkers gaining intellectual independence. It was about a much bigger exchange of civilization's legacy. The Islamic world didn't just trade goods with Europe, it provided the very foundation of scientific progress. Muslim scholars contributed to far more than medicine and astronomy. Fields like mathematics, chemistry, philosophy, and geometry were all part of the vast web of knowledge that spread westward. This transfer wasn't just about translating books. Western universities started studying the works of Muslim scholars. These ideas influenced Europe's greatest intellectual institutions. With this knowledge in hand, the Western world began its own wave of innovation, and the Renaissance was born. Kid, this is how it happened. Passing down knowledge, spreading ideas, sharing civilization's legacy, it's all connected. Once upon a time, this journey took place between the Islamic world and Europe. One civilization's contributions laid the groundwork for another's rise. And these exchanges don't just change a single era, they shape the future of humanity. The scientific legacy that Islam shared with Europe didn't just ignite the Renaissance, it helped shape the course of all human history. If you think of Islamic science as a key, then that key was what unlocked the door to Europe's transformation. And what happened next, kid? The Renaissance took off, and humanity stepped into a whole new era. But never forget, every revolution carries the seeds of the next. Knowledge has always been passed down, and it always will be. Now go, remember these lessons, and see the world with new eyes.